I'm back. I hope that the coffee tasted good. Let us now move on to our second panel with focus on foreign policy, Iran and foreign policy and regional relations. To our help, as I said, we have a very distinguished panel. And my first speaker is Anise Tabriz, Baziri Tabriz, Research Fellow at Royal United Services Institute in London. Anisa is a research fellow at RUSI. Her research is concerned with security in the Middle East, with particular focus on Iran's foreign and domestic politics. She is also a PhD candidate at the War Studies Department of King's College. Anisa is invited to talk to us about the EU-Iran relationship. Welcome, Anisa. The floor is yours.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Mino. Okay, I will talk a little bit about what is going on between EU and Iran. If I have to summarize what has happened in the past few months after the JCPOA, I would define the new relationship as a new beginning, as a new chapter, in line with the title of this conference. It's true that the changes in relationship between Iran and the EU has not been so dramatic, so drastic as it has been for the US and Iran. The two have been continuing to talk to each other throughout the nuclear crisis. They have continued to maintain relations, but I think the developments in the past few months still are quite significant. The first one is that the EU policy towards Iran is now actually, once again, an EU policy towards Iran. Between 2003 and 2015, it has been mostly, if not exclusively, led by the E3, France, the United Kingdom, and Germany. So when the nuclear crisis started, everything else was put aside in terms of both issues discussed, but also in terms of countries which interacted with Iran. And the three countries took the lead on the nuclear issue, later joined in 2004 by the High Representative Solana. But the other countries have been mostly discussing about other issues on Iran with the E3 and the High Representative only during the Foreign Affairs committees. And most of the discussion were focusing on sanctions, what sanction entities should have been added or removed from the list. And this was actually one of the issues that was creating tensions between the E3 and the other EU countries for quite a long time, especially since 2010. Also, especially again since 2010, the EU countries had to curtail a lot of their national interests toward Iran because of the nuclear issue and because of what was the lead of the E3 and of the High Representative. So their interest was to basically focus on the nuclear issue. And to do that, they decided also to implement a unilateral sanction, particularly since 2010. And because of that, as Magnus, I think, mentioned, several countries, particularly southern markets, had to curtail significantly their interest with Iran. He spoke about Italy, Greece, and Spain in particular, but other countries as well. They had to drastically reduce their trade with Iran. And of course, this was not an easy step. It took a lot of discussion within the EU. It took a lot of pressure, both from the US but also from the High Representative, to convince other EU countries to come along and to come on board the E3 policy against Iran. So this was something that was quite dramatic in terms of the policy. And when you were going to the external services or to the desk officer at the external services, there were quite a lot of complaints about how other EU countries have been marginalized in the discussion with Iran. This has drastically changed after the JCPOA. The first task that basically the EU has taken was to establish a task force at the external service, at the European External Action Service. This was in September, so the JCPOA was announced in July. Already in September, we had a task force which is composed by 7 members. And basically the role of this task force is to deal with all EU-Iran related issues. there are three main tasks that the task force basically had to take place. The first one is the monitoring of the JCPOA. We know that, of course, the EU, and particularly Mogherini, is the chair of the Joint Committee, which is going to be monitoring the implementation of the JCPOA for the next 10 years. So this is quite significant. The second task is to monitor the bilateral relations between the EU and Iran on a general level. And the first step has been in this direction, has been to discuss, and now it seems to implement the possibility of opening an EU diplomatic presence in Iran for the first time. Now we have a special representative, and in the last visit, Mogherini has allegedly been speaking with the Iranians about technical, logistical issues for opening this diplomatic presence in Iran. And the third task of the task force is to discuss regional framework cooperation. For this reason, they basically institutionalized meetings between EU and Iran representative at the deputy level. So we have Helga Schmidt, the Deputy Secretary General of the External Service, discussing at the moment with either Araghchi or Abdollahian, depending on the issue, which are Deputy Foreign Minister in Iran. And their level of dialogue is called high-level dialogue, and it basically involves a number of issues, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. So this has been, something that has been drastically shifting the EU foreign policy on Iran in terms of being an actual EU foreign policy, again institutionalized, like it was before 2005, when the relationship between Iran and the EU was decided and discussed at the Commission level, at the Council level, and not just exclusively at the E3 level plus the High Representative. Of course, we have, as we heard again from Magnus before, bilateral relations continue to be strong, and actually stronger, if we may, with countries like Italy, France, Sweden, going and basically visiting Iran, both with trade delegation, but also with political delegation, and enhancing their bilateral ties with Iran. But this goes hand in hand with also enhancing at the EU level in itself. The second development, which I find very interesting and promising, is the fact that now the EU is talking with Iran again about not only the nuclear issue, but a larger number of issues. So again, this was the case before 2003 and especially 2005. Iran and the EU had first a critical dialogue, then a comprehensive dialogue, through which they were discussing issues such as drug, security in the region, weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, and so on and so forth, human rights as well. This dialogue was completely halted in 2005 and already slowed down in 2003 after the nuclear crisis emerged. And now there is a trend in the direction of starting again dialogue in all the aforementioned issues. And this is particularly the task of the task force when they're talking about regional framework cooperation, so the third task of the task force, they are talking about all these issues. For example, we have seen the visit of Mogherini being in the direction also of discussion of civil nuclear energy cooperation with a potential deal on EU-Iran exchange and cooperation on this particularly sensitive field, but also issues such as energy, research, innovation, stability in the region. We have been once again seeing Mogherini talking about the role of Iran, potential role of Iran in Syria, directly with Iran in the last visit. This was a first, but also in the trade and commerce area. Of course, a trade cooperation agreement was something very important, which was discussed particularly between 2003 and 2005, between Iran and the EU, and once again, it was halted. And now there is this sense that trade and cooperation agreement will come back as one area of future development. Again, as Magnus mentioned, trade drastically reduced between the EU and Iran, and basically it was up until 2004, it was about 14 billion euros, and it dropped to 6.5 billion in 2014. So of course, there is a lot of potential and interest by both sides to go back to the level of pre-nuclear issue. One other area, of course, is the cultural exchanges, which was mentioned by Rusbe, which continue to be something that was discussed by the EU and Iran, but of course, with visa issues and political challenges, it has been quite difficult to implement in practice. The third area of change in EU and Iran relations has been the fact that the EU has been quite successfully, I would say, distinguished itself from the US in the past few months, which was not the case, particularly between 2010 and 2015. Of course, we know that the EU has worked very closely with the US in the dual-track policy, which was basically a combination of sanctions and diplomacy from 2006 onward, when the nuclear dossier was referred to the UN Security Council. But after 2010, when again unilateral sanctions were for the first time implemented by the EU, for the first time the EU was perceived by Iran as basically the US. In terms of policy, in terms of attitude, in terms of dialogue, in terms of how sanctions were implementing and used as not a negotiating tool, a bargaining tool, there was the assumption that the EU had the same interests and the same approach as the US. And I would say that this has been changing quite a lot in the past few months. The first thing has been already happening before, slightly before the JCPOA, when the JCPOA was going to be announced, and there was already a perception that the main challenge was going to be Congress. And EU politicians, EU foreign ministers, for the first time traveled to the US, to DC, and went to Congress to basically beg them not to ruin the possibility of have the JCPOA implemented and then adopted by Congress. So that was the first time, and this was quite significant because from 2010, actually the EU accepted whatever was the policy of the US, including extraterritorial sanction, including the impact of secondary legislation on third countries and companies, meaning the EU companies. So this was a quite big shift from what was the attitude before 2015. The other issue on which, for example, the EU has raised its voice was ballistic missiles. The tests that Iran has been conducting have been condemned by the US, and there have been attempts in the past few months to implement sanctions at the UN Security Council level. And even in the past few weeks, after Mogherini visited Tehran, she stated that these tests do not constitute a threat to the JCPOA at all, which is, again, quite interesting to see compared to what has been the attitude of the US. The last thing, and I think it's very interesting still, is the attitude of EU politicians and companies toward financial issues and financial transactions. It's true, as Magnus mentioned, that we still have significant challenges in having this transaction taking place, but the attitude, again, of the EU has been quite interesting to see. They have been not only put pressure on the US legislator to basically clarify what are the legitimate business that EU companies can be conducting, but also to financial institutions as well. For example, Mogherini herself, the trip that she conducted in Tehran was partially and openly stated as a commitment to basically talk to financial institutions to reassure them they can actually conduct business and with Iranian entities without incurring into sanctions. And Cameron, for example, has been writing a letter, issuing a statement to Barclays to complain about the fact that Barclays did not conduct a financial transaction between a company, a British company, which wanted to sell to Iran in the past few months. So, this is, again, quite significant compared to what was the attitude, submissive attitude of the EU before 2015. And again, it's true that financial institutions, main and big financial institutions, are still refraining from conducting business with Iran. But we do have banks. I have to write that down because I never heard of them before. KBC from Belgium, DZ from Germany, and some Austrian bank also are openly conducting transactions with Iranian entities, which again, it's quite interesting to see as a development because these come to the dismay of US pressure not to do so. This does not mean that, of course, the track record is super positive and there is nothing else that can be done. Of course, it takes time. The sanctions are still in place, and the impact of the secondary legislation seems to be challenging to overcome in the short term. So I'm not sure how long it will take for that to be an issue to be solved before EU companies can actually reprise to the fullest their trade relation with Iran. And also in terms of what was mentioned before, competition with other countries which had basically taken over what was the EU trade relationship with Iran, particularly China, but also India, South Korea. Yes, of course, Iran prefers to deal with Western companies and EU companies. It always stated that in terms of quality, prestige, Iran has always looked west in this regard. But at the same time, after the JCPOA was signed and announced, the first country which was invited to travel to Iran was China. And this was because China always stood close to Iran throughout this negotiation, and it was the one that basically objected unilateral sanction until the very end. So because of that, I think there is going to be still a tendency of Iran to maintain strong relationship with this country that stood close to Iran in the past few years. And in terms of Iran's challenges, what has been presented before with regard to corruption, money laundering, and this legislation. Of course, the reformists, the moderate, I would say, Rouhani and his administration have been trying very hard in the past few months to overcome this issue. They have passed a legislation in parliament which addresses specifically anti-money laundering. But again, because of the political challenges and struggles that Rouzbeh has mentioned, I think it's going to be quite hard for the current administration to overcome basically the issues in having those who have an economic stake, particularly the IRGC, but not only, in the Iranian economy, get away and be open to Iran opening up to the West once again. What can be done from the EU? I think the EU has still quite a lot to do in terms of improving its image in the eyes of Iran. Of course, things have been much better in the past few months, and as I say, like the fact that it has been distinguishing itself from the US quite clearly, it's a plus. But there is two things that are still problematic. First, I think this is going to be probably more addressed by Dina, the relationship of European countries with the GCC. And this has been problematic and has been seen as a legacy of the trade relationship and the political relationship that EU countries have been continuing to maintain in the past few years. And it will affect somehow negatively potential development also, both politically but also economically between the EU and Iran. And the other thing is that still, like despite the fact that the EU foreign policy now is more a EU foreign policy rather than a E3, when you talk to Iranian officials, they still see member states as dominating EU foreign policy. They don't see the EU foreign policy as being a strong actor and being basically a united actor. And this is problematic. And the fact that the E3 has conducted the Iran foreign policy on the nuclear issue for so many years is going to be difficult to get away from in the Iranian mind. And the fact that the Syria dossier, the Syria talks have been conducted once again from the E3 plus Italy and the High Representative rather than from the High Representative itself. So the member states are still having a big stake in the decision-making process on high politics issue. I think it's going to be problematic in terms of shaping the image of a united and single EU foreign policy dealing with Iran. I will stop here and will be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. Anissa, before I let you go and
Yeah.
come back to the Q&A, what can a small country like Sweden do in order to improve the relationships between EU and Iran? What if you could give the Swedish government an advice, what would that be?
Well, I think what Magnus mentioned about being present there and establishing bilateral relationship already before, this is a plus. But I think, in terms of people-to-people relation, I think there is a lot that small countries can do better and, in a higher level than bigger countries. Like I mentioned briefly, cultural exchanges, but this is, I think, one field that can have a strong impact on how a EU countries is perceived in Iran. You have, what was mentioned by Roosevelt, a very, very young population, which in many cases has the interest of going abroad in EU countries. So having them here for a period of time, I think can be very, very influential in shaping and improving the bilateral relationship in the long term. And not only political, but also economically speaking. Yeah.
And maybe also for Swedes to go into Iran for
Yes,
for
absolutely.
study or something.
Absolutely. We know about, like the presence of Middle Eastern centers here. I think, like in the UK, for example, there has been a tendency to send Iranians to study in Iran, to study Persian. This is something that can be done more easily right now. Again, like once, it was more difficult for specifically visa issue, but also politically speaking, because of diplomatic relationship between the EU and Iran. In generally speaking, now I think it's more easy to establish more institutionalized connection between university, institutional education center in Sweden and Iran, in the specific instance of Sweden.
How important would you say that the things that we do today, like having a seminar about Iran, is?
Very important. We should do more of them. Of course, Iran has been a hot topic. It has been always been a hot topic, but there is still a lot of misunderstanding of what is taking place within Iran domestically. What is Iran's foreign policy? What are Iran's foreign policy interests? What are Iran's views of the West, of Iran, of the EU, of the United States. So I think doing these kind of exchanges to understand what is the Iranian perception, but also the European perception toward Iran are really helpful.
So broaden our perspectives and deepen our knowledge.
Yes.
We're looking forward to welcoming you back for the Q&A session. Please let me introduce to you another very distinguished panelist today. Dina Esfandiari is a MacArthur Fellow at the Center for Science and Security Studies at King's College in London. Prior to this, she was a research associate in the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Program of the IISS. Before joining IISS, she worked at the Disarmament NGO in Geneva, Switzerland, and her research focused on security, relations between states, and non-proliferation in the Middle East, including Iran and Syria. Dina is here today to talk about the relationship to GCC. Very welcome.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for welcoming me here. As Minu said, I'll talk a little bit about Iran-GCC relations. So we're now almost a year after the deal. And one of the ideas of the nuclear agreement was to empower those who pursued the deal, so the Rouhani administration. And the idea was to have more scope for moderation in Iran's policies, whether internal or external. So over time, the agreement should actually temper Iran's regional policy. But sadly, in the medium term, it looks like there's going to be greater intra-regional tensions. The fear that the agreement would deeply intensify a regional Cold War, have it turn hot, has actually materialized in the short term, I would say. The GCC concern with Iran was not so much Iran's nuclear program, but what they perceive as Iran's expansionist regional policy. They really view Iranian influence in the region absolutely everywhere. And it's remarkable how little change there has been in their perception of Iran pre and post deal. If anything, the only change there has been is that it's actually, their perception of Iran has actually worsened since the deal. To them, they see that the agreement providing Iran with further means to fund its proxies and to continue destabilizing the region. It's a very much an Iran has won mentality that you view in the GCC states. And all of the regional conflicts are viewed with the background of, you know, preventing Iran's expansion, preventing Iran from moving forward, but also to counter what they perceive as US abandonment and complacency in the region. And they view this very much as a legacy of the Obama administration. So what I'll do is, I won't look at all GCC states. I'll look at some of the key states and give you some ideas of where I think they're going at the moment. So I'll begin with Saudi Arabia. It's most obviously the most anti-Iran country in the sub-region, and it kind of leads the rest of the GCC. It's been most vocal in its skepticism of the negotiations, and while it accepted the nuclear agreement, I think it even came out with a couple of positive statements towards the agreement, it really did not, it refused to accept the perceived situation that it led to, which is that it strengthened Iran in the region. Now, the flip side of that is that Iran doesn't really help itself either. Iran has made a number of statements such that, you know, I think it was one of the leaders of the IRGC that came out and said that we now control 4 Arab capitals. Its missile tests have been quite provocative. And so Saudi Arabia really watches what Iran is doing and takes it at face value. What's more, they're incredibly nervous about this, what they perceive to be a new US-Iran axis in the region that is done at their expense, so that the GCC states are being very much abandoned by the US. So what has it done? It's become much more assertive in its foreign policy. And Riyadh basically intends to counter the perceived Iranian influence either overtly or through checkbook diplomacy by everything that it's doing in the region. The problem is that so far, it hasn't been very effective. What's more, it's made Riyadh look quite bad since the agreement. Yemen is a humanitarian crisis and a good example of that. And the problem is in Syria, there is not enough of a GCC effort in Syria to warrant, you know, deeper involvement of the GCC states in resolving the Syria crisis. And then you have other things that the Saudis have done, like the hanging of Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr in January, which kind of led to this spiral of worsening relations between Riyadh and Tehran. So following the agreement, what we've seen and what we're likely to continue seeing is that the need to counter Iran is going to become further entrenched in Riyadh and to a certain extent other GCC states' minds. This, sadly, is going to inflame sectarian tensions in the region for the foreseeable future, and I would say certainly for the short to medium term. The UAE has traditionally followed Saudi Arabia's lead. It hasn't really questioned Riyadh as much in its policies and just tends to follow it blindly. But what's been interesting is I've witnessed kind of a little bit of background murmurs of discontent with what's going on, and the beginnings of a schism between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. And the reason for that is largely because of the coalitions that the UAE has become involved in the region, in Syria, but particularly in Yemen. The UAE has taken on a significant amount of this involvement in these regional crises, and they're now having the counter effect of that, which is they're starting to see the body bags come home. And they don't really understand their involvement, or they're not getting much for their involvement, but getting a lot of negativity, a lot of casualties, and obviously not great effect on their reputation, particularly with regards to what's going on in Yemen. So the question is this discontent going to lead to a change in rhetoric and support? In my view, in the short term, absolutely not. This discontent is very much behind the scenes. They try to really keep it on the down low, but it is going to be interesting to watch it as a development, largely because Iran, much like in the US Congress, in the GCC has been very much a unifying force, other than, I always put Oman aside, but other than Oman, most of the other GCC countries really have followed Riyadh's lead in their policies on Iran. So if you start to see, small schisms developing between them, it'll be really interesting to see where it goes and whether this is going to have a stopping effect on some of the policies that Riyadh has in the region. What's more, the UAE actually has its own internal divisions with regards to Iran. As I'm sure you know, the battles between the state of Abu Dhabi and the state of Dubai are quite intense. Abu Dhabi is known for being quite anti-Iran, and again, very much in line with what Riyadh says. But Dubai has been, as was mentioned earlier, a hub for trade and transshipment of goods to Iran. Dubai makes a lot of its money from trading with Iran, and Dubai is very much looking forward to this next phase of things now that sanctions have been lifted. But there's a real tension between the two states, because Abu Dhabi has, even though the UAE as a whole stands to gain from sanctions being lifted, Abu Dhabi has been very difficult and has told Dubai to really, lay back on boosting trade with Iran, and we're not interested in getting involved. And so this tension, which died down, I would say, after 2010, between 2010 and last year, has kind of resurfaced now, because you have one state that really wants to go ahead and get in on the action with Iran, and Abu Dhabi kind of restraining it and saying, no, we still run the country, so you have to follow our lead. So that's the UAE. Qatar, there's not much that can be said other than that in the last few years, it tried to become a little bit more overt in its foreign policy. In Iran as well, it tried to kind of set the tone a little bit more, split from Saudi. But what's been interesting is it seems that Doha realizes that hasn't paid off as much, and in the last little while is kind of falling more in line once again with Riyadh on how it views Iran. The only difficulty with Qatar is that because of the gas fields that it shares with Iran, it can't have an overtly negative policy towards Iran, because it has to work with Tehran on the gas fields in particular. So one of the other concerns with the agreement was that it would lead to what we call a regional proliferation cascade, which is basically, a buzzword or a buzzword way of saying that the fear was that an agreement with Iran would lead to either a proliferation of civilian nuclear programs in the region, or worst case scenario, the proliferation of a nuclear weapon in the region. Now, the weapon issue, I think, is largely off the table. Many people say that, but the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, the defense relationship, has been a pretty close one. And so Riyadh is going to turn around and cash in its investment in Pakistan's defense industry. I think that's being a tad unfair on the Pakistanis, who have spent the better part of the last decade or so trying to normalize their nuclear program and trying to seem like a more normal actor, and also it also doesn't take into consideration the US influence over both Pakistan and Riyadh. So I don't really see that as a viable option. Now, the other possibility is the spread of civilian nuclear programs in the region, and the first thing that needs to be said about that is that is totally and absolutely legitimate. Nuclear programs are not something that are particularly risky, and if they're done right, they're, power to them for diversifying their energy, which the UAE has set the example with their 123 agreement with the US, whereby they've given up domestic enrichment in exchange for getting, the most top-of-the-line nuclear civilian program in their country. So basically, I think that much of this hype is very much baseless, and the regional proliferation cascade is nothing to be too frightened of. There has been a resurgence in interest, particularly from Riyadh's perspective, in kind of speeding up its development of its non-existent nuclear program. But again, this is something that's going to be very costly. It's going to take a lot of time. And keeping in mind that a lot of these GCC countries, except for the UAE, which is very much dependent on the US now in terms of its civilian program, that no other country has the infrastructure, has the human capacity. So all of this is going to take a lot of time to develop, which of course means it's going to give the international community a lot of time to react to it. So are there any opportunities for dialogue between Iran and the GCC? That's the million-dollar question. I would say there are plenty of opportunities for dialogue. The question is, would you want it to be rather on existing regional conflict issues? So for example, Yemen is an example of that. In my view, Yemen is the lowest hanging fruit in terms of dialogue between Riyadh and Tehran in particular. Why? Because it is of utmost importance to Riyadh. It's a neighboring country. Riyadh essentially considers it its own borders. And for Iran, it really is down there in terms of the order of priorities of things in the region. The link between Tehran and the Houthis is not as clear-cut as the media seems to suggest. It is not a link like Iran and Hezbollah. It's very different. Iran doesn't control them as closely, and in fact, when they asked the Houthis not to go into Sana'a, I think it was last year or 2 years ago, the Houthis completely ignored them and went in anyway. So that kind of gives you an example of how those ties are not as clear-cut as we thought they were. So I think that Yemen would be a low-cost confidence-building measure from the Iranian side, but of high value for Riyadh. The problem is when you talk to a lot of GCC officials about would you be willing to talk to Iran on Yemen, because Iranian officials have come out and said that that is something that they're willing to discuss. Many GCC officials turn it around and say no, because Iran shouldn't be present in Yemen in the first place. So you have the first block that's placed there. Syria, I think, is probably, it is an option, but it's a very problematic option. There's a real entrenchment of Iran and the Gulf Arab states in Syria, although the Gulf Arab states are not as involved in Syria as Iran is. And the problem is pulling out of Syria for the Gulf Arabs has become a question of saving face, because they're not quite sure what they want other than getting rid of Assad. And Iran is the clear opposite. What will be interesting in the Syria case will be to watch what I call, quite sadly, the body bag effect again, where every time you've had debate in Tehran about their policy in Syria, it's been as a result of the number of deaths that come out of it. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes in the next little while. So those are the regional conflict issues. The other option in terms of dialogue with the GCC is to talk about less controversial, more small-scale issues. So one area, for example, is on nuclear safety and security. Iran's Bushehr nuclear power plant, which is right on the Persian Gulf, is a real problem for the GCC states, because it lies on the intersection of 3 tectonic plates. So there have been earthquakes there before. Iran is the only country that operates a nuclear power plant but is not a member of the Nuclear Safety Convention. And the winds in that area, as well as the direction of the water flow in that area, kind of would potentially lead any kind of leak from Bushehr onto the shores of the GCC states. So understandably, this is an issue that makes them very, very nervous. Post-deal, there is now a real possibility of this being a topic of conversation between the GCC and Iran, and I think this is something that really needs to be explored. One other area is, are areas that are pretty well known: environmental issues, water scarcity, combating drug trade is something that's come up multiple times. That's something that Iran can talk to the West about, but also about the GCC states. And then finally, the other option is to talk about what I like to call more positive issues, which is academic exchanges, cultural exchanges, real people-to-people exchanges, because at the end of the day, that's how you're going to address misperceptions in the region, and boy, are there many between the GCC states and Iran. The problem with things like that, with the people-to-people exchanges, is that at the moment, the governments of the GCC and to a certain extent Iran, I think, are still a little bit skittish about visa issues. And so while there's a lot of people-to-people exchanges on trade and business, I think on more cultural things, there's still a lot of underlying nervousness. So one example was that there was this young Saudi blogger who was actually living in Iran and had been there for a few months or a year, I can't remember. And she was blogging about her experience in Iran and what it was like to be a Saudi woman living in Iran. And when the Sheikh Nimr assassination occurred and the relations deteriorated, she was one of the first ones to essentially be pulled out of Iran and sent back to Saudi Arabia. So that kind of shows you that there's still a lot of underlying tension and nervousness between those two countries. So there are topics of dialogue. It is possible. The problem is, at the moment, the willingness to talk to one another has been very cyclical, and it's never matched. Much like during the nuclear negotiations between Iran and the West, which were very cyclical. There were times where Iran was keener for negotiations, while there were times that the West was keener. This is the same thing. So we are in a phase where Iran is actually quite keen to reach out to its GCC neighbors. Iran wants to normalize relations. And the Rouhani administration very clearly made it one of his priorities after the nuclear deal. It was one of the first things that he said during his inauguration speech. But today, we're witnessing one of those cycles where the GCC is dead set on no dialogue with Iran, because they're viewing it as Iran being in a position of strength, them being in a position of weakness, and they don't want to talk without unilateral Iranian pullout from, any involvement in any conflict anywhere in the region. And that, of course, is not going to happen anytime soon. So I'll leave it on that positive note. Thank you.
On that happy note, thank you very much, Dina, for a very interesting presentation. I have a question for you. In November last year, I came back from a conference in Bahrain arranged by IISS. And Iran wasn't present at the conference, but a lot of Gulf countries were. And during the entire conference, they were talking about that Iran is the source of all evil in the region. How do we expect Iran to, give them a hand or be friendly, or even come to a conference like that when they talk about their country in that way?
I was at that conference. It was an absolute nightmare.
Yeah, it was, for sure.
Yeah, it was basically 2 full days of Iran bashing. It's a really hard question to answer. I think what Iran is aware of, it depends who you talk to in Iran, but I think certainly what Rouhani's administration and Zarif's ministry is very, very aware of is that, this is an essential neighborhood. There's no changing the configuration of the neighborhood. You're going to have to learn to live with one another, contrary to what one, I won't say the country he's from or what official, but an official from the GCC who once told me that this deal, the negotiations for the deal, was a historic opportunity to kick Iran out of the region. So, this really goes to show their perspective on their relations with Iran. So there is an understanding that this is an essential relationship. And I think we've seen that with some of the overtures that Zarif has shown to the GCC. The problem is, yes, Iran is one country, but it's almost not one government, because you have so many different actors in Iran, and there are a multiplicity of actors who actually don't agree with Zarif's perspective on reaching out to the GCC states. And in fact, many times in the last little while, every time Zarif has come back to either making a speech in favor of the GCC or traveling to the GCC states, he's come back and he's been summoned to parliament for questioning, where people have said, why are you pandering to GCC wishes? Why are you being too nice to them? And the rhetoric amongst some of the hardline circles in Iran has become very anti-Saudi. It used to be just anti-US and anti-Israel, and after Sheikh Nimr's assassination, Riyadh was thrown in there as well for good measure. So I understand GCC frustrations because there is a split in Iran. But what Iran needs to do is try to bind the different factions together and through actions, kind of disregard a lot of what the hardline circles are saying when they say things like we control 4 Arab capitals.
Thank you. We're looking forward to welcoming you back for the Q&A. Let us welcome our last speaker for today. Nicola Pede is the director of the Institute for Global Studies in Rome and is here to give us his perspective on Iran. Welcome, Nicola.
Thank you. Is it working? Yes. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and I'll try to squeeze the time I've been given in order to talk about the relationship between Iran and Syria and between Iran and Iraq. And most of these relations is in this moment in the hands of the security apparatus from the Iranian point of view, and I'll try to put more in terms of the perception from the Iranian side and on how they consider the developments and how they consider the possible opportunities given by the international community in the region. Well, when it comes to Syria, well, Syria is probably the oldest, or at least one of the oldest elements of this axis or alliance in the Middle East, granting security to Iran, granting a credible form of deterrence. So it's an element which is immediately connected to national security. And the protection of Syria became one of the most important elements of the national security strategy of the Islamic Republic of Iran in the recent past. Well, it's what Iran never admitted is that there have been also some domestic issues behind the Syrian civil war. And from the Iranian point of view, the Syrian crisis is mostly, if not entirely, provoked by foreign intervention. So it's an attempt to hit Iran. It's an attempt to hit Iran's security apparatus in the region. And behind this attempt from the Iranian perception, there is, of course, Saudi Arabia and some of its regional allies. And of course, the GCC countries are on the top of the list behind Saudi Arabia and the Iranian perspective. Well, Iran has been quite actively involved in the protection of the Bashar al-Assad regime. And also the Iranian perspective evolved in the last 5 years. There are some more recent developments, of course, with the entrance of the Russian troops on the ground, but in a certain sense, Iran is still defending the idea that national integrity and the natural end of the actual government in Syria should be granted. And this is a sort of preconditions where I think there are some margins of negotiations. I think that there could be, I'm pretty sure that, as Dina said, that there are several opportunities in terms of possibilities of dialogue with the GCC countries and in particular with Saudi Arabia, even if at the moment it seems impossible to summarize this into something practical or into something feasible. The situation deteriorated from the Saudi perception with the arrival of the Russians on the ground. And even the Iranians have modified their posture on the ground, moving from quite low-level presence, which we have noted since the beginning of the crisis until the end of 2013, where most of the activities have been controlled by the special forces or intel. Since the beginning of 2014, there have been a more intense actions from the Iranian side. There have been a revisitation of the ground capacity, the military capacity, and the coordination with both the Syrian army and the Lebanese Hezbollah forces, which are mostly operating in a certain part of the country, in the southern, eastern part of, western part of the country. There have been also some form of disagreement with Hezbollah in a certain phase. And I think that at the moment, the goal is that of concentrating more in the central and the western part of the country, retaking the control of Aleppo, granting security for Damascus and the surrounding area, and in a certain sense fortifying the Alawite area in the central western part of the country. This does not mean that Daesh is not a priority. given the fact that Daesh is mostly present in the eastern part of the country, it means that Daesh it's part of an evolving strategy in the sense that Iran's goal at the moment, as long as the Russian, is that of creating a sort of security status for the troops and the units operating in the central part of the country, granting security and capability in terms of movement and capacity of supply, and then concentrating on the Daesh forces on the other side. Well, the problem for Iranian, Hezbollah, and Syrian forces at the moment is that of holding the areas that they've conquered. So it's not an issue of mission or merely an issue of military capacity. When it comes to the comparison on the ground, I think that the Iranian, Syrian, and Lebanese Hezbollah forces are, in a certain sense, comparable to those of the antagonist. And I'm not entering into the debate of who they are, in the sense that there is a quite large confusion of, on the side of which are the opposition forces, their sponsors, and the capacity of acting as a monolithic or as a quite, on the contrary, a quite competitive apparatus. For the Iranians, the problem is it's clearly that of adding some capacity in order to hold the position that have been conquered, and in order not to be immediately chased by the opposition troops in some of the areas where they have been successfully from a military point of view, but unable to control the area with their logistic. It's also becoming a question of an issue of cost. It's not clear how much Iran is spending in Syria at the moment, but it seems that something around $6 to $10 billion per month could be the credible amount of money which have been spent by the Iranian government in Syria, which is unaffordable in the long term, as it is unaffordable for the Russians on their side. So there is the need, also from a political point of view, there is the need to find a solution, but there is a need to find a solution which could be credible in terms of military capacity on the ground. So it's quite controversial. The real capacity from the side of the Iranians, the Hezbollah, and the Syrian government, and as well as of the Russians on the other side, to be credible in proposing a solution for the long term. I think that there is a visible distance between Iran and Russia in terms of perception for the future, in the sense that there is a consensus on how to keep troops on the ground and how to act militarily in the short term. But Iranians are quite concerned with respect to what Russians are thinking in terms of the future of Bashar al-Assad. And I think that it's quite clear in Tehran at the moment that Bashar al-Assad is not a priority for Moscow. While at the same time it's becoming again a priority for Tehran protecting Bashar al-Assad, or at least use Bashar al-Assad as a card, a strong card within the negotiation. Hezbollah again started controlling a portion of the southern part of Syria and is cooperating actively with both Iranian, Syrian and Russian forces. And one of the most difficult and potentially dangerous variables which have been presented by Hezbollah in terms of evolution of the crisis is the possibility of an Israeli intervention, a quick intervention in southern Syria. If this were to happen, this could be a wild card, difficult to predict and to manage in terms of balances on the ground. And despite the fact that Hezbollah, it's only posing this as a variable, and it's trying to present it as a non-immediate form of threat, there is a huge concern in Beirut with respect to what could be done by the Israelis along with the Saudis in managing part of the opposition to the Syrian government. There is an increase in in the role of the Iranian security apparatus in Syria in the recent past. So the first phase where only special forces and military consultants were working with the Syrian government, we moved to a phase where a much more solid apparatus linked to the IRGC was operating on the ground, toward a new phase where we are now, where the IRGC is not only operating on the ground with its own special forces and with part of the Artesh, so the traditional armed forces, but they're also using a couple of newly established units, sort of foreign legion created by the Iranians in order to grant additional capacity to the Syrian forces on the ground and to provide enough units to be deployed on the ground. It's, of course, extremely difficult to find out how many people is actually fighting on the ground in Syria from on the side of Iran and on the side of Hezbollah. But I think that a credible number could be summarizing the two between 20 and 25,000 units on the ground. So this means that Syria is a key priority for Iran. This means that Syria will be a key priority, not only in terms of the direct relations with the regional actors, but also with the international community. And frankly speaking, I don't think that the international negotiations are providing a clear map or a feasible solution at the moment for all the actors involved. One of the issues that should be noted is that Iran seems to be more concerned in Syria at the moment by the Jabhat al-Nusra forces and the environment around Jabhat al-Nusra, so basically the Qaedist forces, rather than the Daesh groups. And it's vocally telling the Western countries that the most dangerous element in this crisis is represented by Jabhat al-Nusra and the role that the units around Jabhat al-Nusra are playing and the level of connection that they are able to show in terms of foreign fighters or capacity of acquiring weapons, equipments, or financement from outside. So Iran is raising the red flag of the Qaedist forces as the main threat in Syria. And this is, in a sense, the opposite of what they're saying in Iraq, where Daesh coming to Iraq, it's still the most relevant threat for of course, for the Iraqi government, but also for the Iranian security apparatus. Well, Iraq, and I don't know how. 2 minutes, so I'll squeeze it in 2 minutes. Iraq is a different security environment for Iran. It's well, first of all, I think that Iran still had to cope with the huge series of mistakes which have been done by the al-Maliki administration in the past. So in sectorizing the conflict up to a level where Daesh emerged as a relevant, not only military force, but also social force, at least in a certain phase of the conflict, not entering into the Anbar or other areas, but simply showing up in areas where they have been mostly welcomed, at least at the beginning. So the fight in Daesh in Syria will be completely different from in terms of operational capacity from what is required in Syria. It will be part of not only of a military process, but also of a political process that should be done with the cooperation of the Iranian forces. And even if Iran is actively involved on the ground in Iraq and supporting the Iraqi troops in trying to reconquering some of the areas which are still under control of Daesh, and which is a large portion of the country still today, I think that there is an exaggeration, especially in the West, on the role that Iran could play in Iraq, on the influence that Iran could exert on in Iraq, and not admitting that the Iraqi government it's not only independent but is also factional as the Iranian is, and so expressing different positions and different strategic visions with respect to the alliance with Iran and with the need to fight against Daesh and the other groups operating on the ground. I think that it's more stable, these relations, but again, the kind of mission, the kind of conflict that they're fighting is probably even more difficult than the one that they're fighting in Syria. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Let us change place and welcome Dina and Anise back. And I know we are running out of time, so for those of you that have to sneak out, please feel free to do so. Nicola, please join us for the Q&A. Thank you. Let's open up for questions from the audience. Yes, go ahead, sir.
My name is Stefan Kristiansson. We have heard a lot about Iran's relations with the US, EU, GCC, China, etc. No one has so far mentioned Russia. Is Russia still an important player for Iran after the sanction has been lifted and so on? Politically, military-wise, security-wise, or economically, business-wise, etc.
Thank you. Great question. Who wants to start?
You can start, and then we. Yeah, sure.
Well, I think it's a relevant partner. It became a quite solid ally of Iran. I don't think that it's a white check for the Iranians. So I don't think that the Iranians are betting on Russia all the chip they have to spend on, especially in terms of security vision for the future. So there are some differences. There are, if you look at the various areas where they're involved, like of course the Syrian conflict is the most evident part of their cooperation, and even within the Syrian conflict, I think that there are divergences, or at least potential divergences between the Iranian and the Russian vision in the long term. Both are, in a sense, in a hurry in order to find a solution because they cannot sustain in the long term, economically speaking, the cost of the conflict. But of course, the Iranian interest is completely different from the Russian interest in Syria, and the integrity of the country and the continuity of, if not Bashar al-Assad, but at least its political environment, it's something like a dogma for the Iranians. And the Russians have a more wide spectrum of possibilities in front of them. And so there are several other options that could be considered by Moscow and within the Syrian crisis. More in general terms, I think that even in the bilateral relations, there are a lot of good opportunities for cooperation. Russia is, of course, quite near to Iran, but in the long term, the more the opening to the West could be developed from the Iranian side, the more could be problematic in terms of the Russian perception of this. So I think that there could be some, not clashes, but of course some problematic kind of visions in the bilateral dimensions potentially in the future.
Thank you.
I would just to add to that, I'd look at the relationship on two levels. So you have the kind of economic trade cooperation level. And Russia, much like China, although not as long as China, has been around in Iran for a little bit. Russia is a huge contributor to Iran's nuclear program, for example. So the relations are there. There is a little bit of history to it. They are continuing. Much like China, though, there is a little bit of fatigue on the Iranian side with, Russian products, Russian reliability, and I think that contributed to Iran's perhaps return to the negotiating table on the nuclear program in order to allow it to look west like it wanted to. So that's the first level. The other aspect of the relationship, I would say, is the political security, military dimensions of it. And you've covered that pretty well. The only thing I would add to that is I think that in Syria, the Iranians were a little bit surprised by the change in tone in their relationship. I think Iran had a pretty good grasp or a pretty good understanding that it was the bigger player in that relationship in Syria at first, and that it was very much calling the shots. And you now, a couple years later, Tehran is looking at the relationship and thinking, wait a minute, actually Russia's calling a lot of the shots right now. And I think there is a very real worry in Tehran about this total reversal in dynamics in that relationship. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
I totally agree, and I think we could define relations between Iran and Russia as a marriage of convenience. Of course, they have been quite close in the past few years, particularly because of the nuclear issue. Russia has stood on the side of Iran, basically objecting unilateral sanction at the UN Security Council and managing to tone down the nature of the UN Security Council resolution, which were adopted by the P5+1. But at the same time, I think the Syria dossier will be the deal breaker in what kind of nature the relationship between Iran and Russia will take. And the reason is, of course, the issue of Assad, which Nicola mentioned, but also the long-term interest in Syria. The perception, from my understanding, the perception in Iran is that Russia is using Syria as a tool to negotiate with the US on other issues rather than a matter of interest in itself. So, the fact that there is this kind of tension and this kind of distrust, which came out quite a lot of time in the past few months, the S-300 issue, the missile issue was one of them. But of course also the relationship between Russia and Hezbollah or Israel, whatever you want to point out, the fact that Russia has coordinated, allegedly, attacks conducted by Israel against the targeted targets in Syria of Hezbollah. It's telling with regard to the type of relationship that Russia is having, not only with Israel but also with GCC countries. The relationship between Russia and Riyadh, Qatar, have been quite good. So Iran has been, quite skeptical about having a full alliance with Russia. And I think development in Syria will be telling us more about what kind of nature the relationship will take.
Thank you. 2 more questions. Magnus, go ahead.
Yes, Magnus Rubik. I'd love to hear also your comments on the bilateral relations between Iran and Turkey, especially at the backdrop of the increased frictions between Russia and Turkey. So please.
Yeah, this is very much, I think, related to actually a relationship between Iran and Russia. I think because relationship between Iran and Russia are taking a kind of a difficult kind of nature, Iran has been getting closer to Turkey once again. Iran and Turkey have been having difficulties after the Syrian crisis. Of course, they are fighting on opposite sides. And that has been the main, if not the only issue on which Iran and Turkey have not been having good relationship. Trade has been continuing, and of course Turkey has once again helped Iran during the nuclear issue, and basically it helped overcoming some of the sanctions with gold trade and also with the gas versus oil trade. And I think this kind of relationship is re-emerging once again now that tensions are emerging with Russia. So we have seen the foreign minister, Turkish foreign minister, traveling to Tehran very recently, actually after Russia decided to withdraw or partially withdraw its troops from Syria. And then we saw both Rouhani and Zarif traveling to Istanbul right after. So I think there is this kind of tension re-emerging, also because of one common strategic interest in Syria, which is what Nicola has mentioned, which is territorial integrity. This is something that both Iran and Turkey have dearly at hand. They want to maintain Syria united. And they are both concerned about the Kurdish issue. So I think this is going to be a factor in getting them closer once again.
Thank you.
Just had a comment on. I think it's really difficult to see a future of the relations between Iran and Turkey, not in the path which have been presented by Anis. So the economic cooperation, I think it's one of the pillars of the Iran-Turkey relations, and even if the crisis in Syria is presenting a threat to this, I think it's quite visible how both are trying to avoid problems in Syria on a bilateral level in order to protect the rest of their relations on the other side. So this is at least a good sign.
Thank you very much. We have 2 more questions and then we'll sum this up. Yes, go ahead, sir.
Rick LaRoche. I'll make it quick. What do you see as Iran's position vis-a-vis the recent fighting between the Shia militia and the Kurds and the recent storming of the parliament at the urging of Muqtada al-Sadr?
I'll start. Well, again, it's. I think that again, Iran is not monolithic. So the reactions in Iran to what happened in Baghdad a few days ago have been quite heterogeneous. There's a lot of people complaining because of what happened. There's a lot of people which is openly saying that Muqtada al-Sadr action has been dangerous, not timely, and potentially detrimental to the interests of the Iraqi governments, while others, of course, are emphasizing its role. So again, Iran is not monolithic, and it's difficult to find, especially in this moment with the parliament, which is basically not yet operational. It's not easy to find out which is the majority behind this kind of position. I think that the more Iraq is stable, the better it is in Tehran. So these up and down with Iraqi policy are not seen as a plus from most of the Iranian political leaders.
Thank you. Any comments, Dina? Lisa?
Nothing
No?
to add.
No? Yes, sir, go ahead.
All right, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for 3 very interesting presentations. I have a question for Dina regarding the relation with Saudi, and it seems like the new, or not the new, but the Deputy Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman have become the new economic force in Saudi Arabia. Do you think that will change the attitude towards Iran in any direction? Thank you.
You know, I believe at the moment, and in the short term, I really think that this fear of Iran that you have in the GCC countries, but in particular among Saudi policymakers, it really is endemic. It's ingrained in their mind. There is such an overpowering perception that Iran is out to get them, that I'm not sure personalities at this stage is going to make that big of a difference. Just because the general shift, the general way that the countries are proceeding so far it's incredibly clear, and there really is domestically a lot of unity in Saudi Arabia on the views on Iran. And for those who tend to disagree, so like I mentioned a little bit, you know, there are some in the UAE that disagree with this view. There is zero desire to bring it up on a public level and zero desire to show that disunity publicly. So I think personalities can't play a role at the moment, sadly.
Thank you very much, guys, for interesting presentations. If you will have a few words to sum up this day and for the future, what should that be? Anise.
No, Nicola, please. I'm very bad at summaries.
Dina.
Well, I mean, I can only speak to what I spoke about in terms of Iran-GCC ties, and I think that there's a great deal of pessimism because actually this is one area where the deal has not had a positive effect like perhaps some people expected it to. But I think it's still reassuring to know that there are potential areas of convergence, there are potential areas of dialogue, and I think that this is where the Europeans and the Americans may be able to play a greater role in essentially forcing Iran and the GCC to sit at a table together. I don't know if there is that willingness certainly in the European Union and perhaps to a lesser extent in the US, but I think that would be a very, very valuable role for them to play.
Thank you. Nicola.
Well, in general terms, not only about the issues in Syria and Iraq, I think that I'm quite optimistic in the sense that I think that what happened in the last year and a half is part of a process which is not reversible. And I think that to reverse this process, the political cost, not only the economic cost, will be too high. So I'm quite optimistic in this sense. And I I don't want to confuse my own personal expectation with the reality on the ground, of course, but I think that the readmittance of Iran within the international context, it's a pivotal result. I think it should be defended at all costs. We should work with Iran more and more. There are a lot of difficulties ahead, of course, and a lot of problems which are still affecting this capacity. And the problem of the banking system, which have been pointed out, is probably one of the biggest at the moment, but it's not the only one. I think that we should try to defend this process at all costs, and I think this is at least one of the few good news that we have seen from the region in the last 15 years. So they should be defended really, really at all costs from all of us.
So positive approach for the future.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Positive.
Thank you all for staying with us today. Have a wonderful day.